They threw a 12-year-old boy out of an airlock's worth of dreams and told him he'd never amount to anything. 20 years later, the same people who signed that expulsion order were standing in a line, hats in hands, begging him to come back and save them. I know how that sounds, like the kind of story people make up to feel better about their own disappointments. But I was there for the beginning of it and the end of it both, and everything in between, and I'm telling you it happened exactly the way I say. His name was Kai. And this is the story of the boy the galaxy threw away, and what he became out in the dark where they couldn't see him, and the day they all came crawling back. Let me start where it started, in the cold. My name is Oren. I'm not going to matter much to this story except as the person who saw it, which is its own kind of mattering, I suppose. Somebody has to be the one who remembers. Back then, I was a junior instructor at the place where all of this began, the Etherium. You have to understand what the Etherium was, or none of the rest of it makes sense. The Etherium was the finest school in the galaxy, not one of the finest. The finest. It was where the galactic community sent its most gifted children, the prodigies, the wonders, the 1 in a billion minds from every species, to be shaped into the thinkers and leaders and creators who would guide civilization forward. It floated in space, a vast gleaming ring of a station orbiting a blue-white star, all soaring halls and quiet libraries and laboratories, where the deepest problems of existence were worked on by the brightest minds alive. To be admitted to the Etherium was the highest honor a young mind could receive. Species competed for its handful of slots. Whole worlds celebrated when one of their children got in. And it was ancient, and it was proud, and like all ancient proud institutions, it had grown very certain of what genius looked like. That's the thing you have to understand. The Etherium had been shaping the galaxy's finest minds for tens of thousands of years, and over all that time, it had developed a very precise idea of what a great mind was. It could measure it. It had tests, beautiful, elegant, sophisticated tests, refined over millennia that could take a young mind and assess its worth with what everyone believed was perfect accuracy. Processing speed, memory, pattern recognition, logical depth. The ability to hold vast structures of abstraction in the mind at once. The Etherium tested for all of it, and it ranked its students by it, and it had never once in all its long history been wrong. Or so it believed. And then, one year, for the first time, a human child was admitted, and everything the Etherium thought it knew about genius was about to be tested in a way it had never been tested before. Humans were new to the Etherium. New to the galaxy, really. We'd only joined the wider community a few generations back, and we were still regarded as a minor species, promising perhaps but unproven, the kind of newcomers you were polite to without taking seriously. No human had ever been admitted to the Etherium. We simply weren't in that league, everyone assumed. Our minds were fine, serviceable, nothing that would stand among the great prodigies of the ancient species. But there was a boy, Kai, from some ordinary human colony world, nothing special, born to nothing special, and by some quirk of the admissions process, a wider net cast that year, a push to seem inclusive of the newer species, Kai was tested, and he scored just high enough, barely, right at the threshold to be admitted, the first human ever. It was a minor sensation at the time, a curiosity. The Etherium admits a human. How novel, how generous of us. I remember when he arrived, 12 years old, young even by the standards of the place which took the gifted early, small for his age, quiet. He had this way of looking at things, at everything, with a kind of total absorption, like the whole world was endlessly interesting, and he couldn't get enough of it. He'd stop in the middle of a corridor to look at the way light came through a window. He asked questions constantly. Not the sharp performative questions the other prodigies asked to show off, but real ones, strange ones, questions that came at things sideways. Why does that machine hum at that pitch and not another? What would happen if it hummed differently? Does the humming mean anything, or is it just an accident of how it's built? The other students didn't know what to make of him. The Ethereum's prodigies were, mostly, exactly what you'd expect: brilliant, arrogant, fiercely competitive, each one the pride of their world, each one certain of their own genius. And here was this small human boy who didn't compete, who didn't show off, who just wondered about things, who found everything fascinating and said so. They thought he was simple, slow even despite his admission scores. Because in the ways the Ethereum measured, in the tests and the rankings, Kai was at the bottom, dead last. He processed slower than the others. His memory was ordinary. He couldn't hold the vast abstract structures the other students juggled effortlessly. By every measure the Ethereum had, he was the least gifted student in the school. But there was something else about him. Something the tests didn't measure, and I saw it, and I was almost the only one who did. I was assigned as one of Kai's instructors, not because anyone valued him, quite the opposite. Taking the human was a low-status assignment given to a junior instructor, which is what I was. Nobody wanted to waste a senior mind on the novelty human who ranked dead last, so I got him. And I'll be honest, I resented it at first. I had ambitions. Babysitting the token human wasn't going to advance them. And then I started actually watching him work. Here's what the tests missed. Here's what took me months to even see, because I'd been trained, like everyone at the Ethereum, to see genius only in the forms the Ethereum recognized. Kai was slow. That was real. He couldn't match the other students in speed or memory or raw processing. But he did something none of them did, something the tests had no category for. He understood things. I don't mean he learned facts. All of them learned facts. I mean he understood, he saw into the heart of a problem, saw why it was the way it was, saw the deep, simple truth underneath the complicated surface. The other prodigies could solve any problem you gave them, fast, elegantly, correctly. But they solved them the way a machine solves them, by processing, by applying learned methods, by brute brilliance. Kai solved them by understanding them. He'd sit with a problem for a long time, much longer than the others, turning it over, wondering about it. And then he'd say something, some quiet observation, that reframed the entire thing, that revealed a truth about it that none of the fast, brilliant students had seen because they were too busy solving it to understand it. I remember the first time it happened in front of me. A physics problem, a hard one, a problem about the behavior of a certain kind of exotic matter that had genuinely puzzled the field for a while. The other students in the seminar attacked it the usual way, with their dazzling speed, generating solutions, competing to be first. And Kai sat quietly, wondering, and then he raised his hand and asked a question. Just a question. He asked, why are we assuming the matter wants to behave the way we're trying to make it behave? What if it's doing exactly what it wants to, and we're the ones who have got the wrong idea about what it wants? And the whole seminar stopped, because it was the right question. It was the question that dissolved the entire problem, not solved it, dissolved it, revealed that the problem was based on a wrong assumption everyone had been carrying. The fast, brilliant prodigies had been racing to solve a problem that Kai, slow and wondering, had seen didn't need to be solved at all, only understood correctly. That was Kai. That was the thing the tests couldn't measure. He didn't have the fastest mind in the Ethereum. He had the deepest. And in an institution that had spent tens of thousands of years learning to measure speed and mistake it for depth, that made him invisible. Worse than invisible. It made him look like a failure. The expulsion came in his second year. He was still 12. Humans grow slower than many species, and he'd been young when he came. The Ethereum had a rule, a hard one enforced without exception for its entire history. Students were ranked continuously by the tests, and any student who fell below a certain threshold and stayed there was removed, cut, sent home. The Ethereum was for the finest minds, and if the test said you weren't among the finest, you didn't belong, and sentiment didn't enter into it. It was, they believed, a mercy in its way. Better to know early that you didn't belong than to waste years failing. Kai ranked dead last. He had from the beginning. And by every test the Ethereum administered, he was not improving, could not improve, because the thing he was bad at was not a thing you get better at, it was just not the kind of mind he had. So the review board convened and they looked at his scores, and the outcome was never in doubt. I spoke for him. I want you to know that. It was the one brave thing I did in this whole story, and it cost me, and I'd do it again. I stood up in front of the review board junior instructor that I was nobody, speaking out of turn, and I told them they were making a mistake. I told them about the exotic matter problem. I told them about the questions he asked, the way he understood things, the depth the tests couldn't see. I told them that Kai was not the least gifted student in the Ethereum, that he was possibly the most gifted, that we simply didn't have the instruments to measure what he had. And the head of the review board, an ancient, distinguished member of one of the oldest species, a being who had shaped great minds for 3,000 years, she listened to me politely, and then she said something I have never forgotten, because it was so certain and so wrong. "Instructor Oren," she said, "I understand your attachment. He is an endearing child, but you are describing charm, not genius. You are describing a slow mind that compensates with pleasant eccentricity. We have seen this many times in 3,000 years. The affection an instructor develops for a struggling student. It is natural. It is also sentiment, and sentiment is precisely the thing our tests exist to correct for. The tests do not lie, instructor. They have never lied. This child ranks last because he is last. Whatever you imagine you see in him, the measurements are clear. He does not belong here. He never did. Admitting him was an experiment, and the experiment has failed. And the kind thing, the responsible thing, is to end it now, before we waste more of his childhood pretending he is something he is not." And they voted, and Kai was expelled. I was there when they told him. They made me be there. I was his instructor. It was my duty to deliver the news. The cruelest assignment of my life. He was 12 years old, small, quiet, and I sat across from him and I told him that the Ethereum had decided he didn't belong, that his scores were too low, that he was being sent home, and I watched his face while I said it. He didn't cry. That surprised me. I'd braced for tears, for pleading, for the collapse of a child being told he's a failure. Kai just went very still and he listened, and when I finished he was quiet for a long moment. And then he asked me a question. Of course he did. He always had a question. He asked, "Is it because I'm not smart enough, or because I'm not smart in the way they measure?" And God help me, I told him the truth. I said, "The second one, Kai, you're smart in a way they can't measure. And because they can't measure it, they can't see it. And because they can't see it, to them it isn't there." I leaned forward. "But it's there. I see it. It's real. Don't you ever let them convince you it isn't real. Do you understand me? What you have is real. They just don't have the eyes for it." And he thought about that in his careful way. And then he said the thing that told me he was going to be all right, someday, somehow. The thing that told me the Ethereum had just made the biggest mistake in its long history and didn't even know it. He said, "Then I'll go find people who have the eyes for it, or I'll go somewhere it matters. Somewhere they need the kind of smart I am, instead of the kind they can measure." He looked at me. The matter didn't want to behave the way they were trying to make it behave. Remember, maybe I'm like that, maybe I'm not broken, maybe I'm just in the wrong problem. He almost smiled. "So I'll go find the right one." And they sent a 12-year-old boy home in disgrace, ranked last, stamped a failure, an experiment that hadn't worked. And I watched his transport pull away from the Ethereum, and I thought I'd never see him again. And I thought the galaxy had just thrown away something precious without ever knowing what it had. I was right about that, but I was wrong that I'd never see him again. Because 20 years later, when the whole galaxy was on fire and every civilization was desperate, and the ancient certainties had all failed at once, 20 years later, they came looking for the boy they'd thrown away. And by then he'd found the right problem. and he'd been quietly, patiently becoming exactly the mind that could solve it, out in the dark, where nobody was watching, where nobody had the eyes to see what he was becoming. I lost track of Kai for a long time. Years. I stayed at the Ethereum. My defense of him had cost me my ambitions, as I said, so I never rose, just stayed a junior instructor, teaching, watching new prodigies come and go, all of them fast and brilliant and shallow, none of them wondering the way Kai had wondered. I thought about him often. I wondered where he'd gone, what he'd become, whether the world had crushed the thing in him that the Ethereum couldn't see. It hadn't. I know that now. But it took me 20 years to learn what he'd done with his exile, and I learned it in pieces, the way you learn about a river by seeing where it's already flowed. Here's what happened to Kai, as best I've been able to reconstruct it. He went home, back to his ordinary human colony world, a failure at 12, the boy who'd washed out of the greatest school in the galaxy, and by every expectation that should have been the end of him. The washed-out prodigy, the peaked-too-early kid, the sad story people tell. He was supposed to be something, went to the Ethereum and everything, but it didn't work out. That's the story that should have been his. But Kai didn't accept the story. He told me he'd go find the right problem, and that's exactly what he did. He didn't try to prove the Ethereum wrong on its own terms, didn't spend his life trying to become fast and brilliant in the ways they measured, trying to force himself into the shape of mind they valued. That would have been the small revenge, and it would have failed because you can't become a kind of mind you aren't. Instead, he did the thing that only someone who truly understood himself could do. He went looking for the places where his kind of mind, the slow, deep, wondering kind, was exactly what was needed. And he found them, out on the edges, in the unglamorous places. In the problems, the fast, brilliant minds of the Ethereum had given up on, because they couldn't be solved by speed. He became a kind of wanderer, a problem solver for hire, but not the ordinary kind. Kai went to the places that were stuck, colony worlds with failing ecosystems no one could fix, stations with systems that had broken in ways no engineer could understand, whole societies tangled in problems that had defeated every expert. The desperate places. The places the galaxy's brilliant minds had looked at, declared unsolvable and abandoned. And Kai would arrive, quiet and unassuming, and he would do the thing he did. He would wonder. He'd sit with the problem for weeks, sometimes much longer than any brilliant consultant would ever spend, and he'd ask his strange sideways questions, and he'd come to understand the problem so deeply, so truly, that the solution would simply reveal itself. Because that was always his gift, not solving but understanding. And it turned out that the problems the galaxy couldn't solve weren't unsolvable. They were just misunderstood. Everyone had been racing to solve the wrong version of them, the way the seminar had raced to solve the exotic matter problem that didn't need solving. And Kai, slow and wondering, would see the real problem underneath, and the real problem, correctly understood, could be solved. He fixed a dying world's ecosystem by realizing that everyone had misidentified which species was keystone, that they'd been frantically protecting the wrong thing while the actual foundation of the whole system quietly collapsed, unnoticed. He fixed a station's impossible system's failure by understanding that the failure wasn't a malfunction at all, but the system correctly responding to a problem no one had noticed. Over and over, across years and place after place, Kai did the thing the brilliant couldn't do. He understood, and understanding, he healed. And a reputation began to grow, quiet at first, word of mouth on the edges in the desperate places. There's someone you can call when everyone else has given up, a human. Slow, they say, strange, asks a lot of questions. But he sees things no one else sees. If your problem is truly impossible, if the best minds in the galaxy have looked at it and walked away, then he's the one you call. Because impossible is his specialty. Impossible is just a problem that hasn't been understood yet. They started calling him the Understander. In the old trade tongues of the frontier, there's a word for it, someone who sees to the bottom of things, and that became his name, out in the dark, among the people the Ethereum never bothered with. The understander, the one who sees. He didn't do it for glory. That's the thing that everyone got wrong later when the story became famous. Kai never sought recognition, never tried to make the Ethereum regret what it did, never built a reputation on purpose. He just went where he was needed and did what he could and moved on. He lived simply. He stayed quiet. 20 years of quietly healing the galaxy's unsolvable wounds, one at a time, in places no one important was watching. But here's the thing about doing deep work in the dark for 20 years. You get deep. Kai, who had understood things faster than anyone even as a child, spent 2 decades doing nothing but understanding things, the deepest, hardest, most tangled problems the galaxy had, the ones everyone else had given up on, and understanding compounds. Each problem he understood made him better at understanding the next. Each deep truth he uncovered connected to others. Over 20 years, quietly in the dark, Kai didn't just become a good problem solver. He became something the galaxy had never produced before. A mind that understood the deep structure of things across every domain, that had spent 20 years seeing to the bottom of everything, that had developed an intuition for the truth beneath complexity that no fast, brilliant Ethereum prodigy could ever match. He became, without anyone important noticing, quite possibly the most profound mind alive. Not the fastest, not the most brilliant by any test the Ethereum had, but the deepest, the one who understood most truly, and the Ethereum had thrown him out at 12 for ranking last. The galaxy had no idea what it had let slip away into the dark, until the day it desperately, catastrophically needed exactly what Kai had become. The crisis, when it came for everyone at once. They called it the Unraveling. I'll try to explain it simply, the way Kai eventually explained it to me, because the details don't matter as much as the shape. The galactic civilization, all of it, every species, the whole vast interconnected community, ran on a deep technology, an ancient one, the foundation beneath everything, the network of faster-than-light travel and communication, the systems that let a galaxy-spanning civilization exist at all. This technology was so old and so fundamental that no one really understood it anymore. It had been built up over tens of thousands of years, layer on layer, each generation adding to it and refining it until it had become impossibly complex. A vast, intricate, ancient machine that the entire civilization depended on and that no single mind, no matter how brilliant, comprehended in full. Everyone just used it. Everyone trusted it. It worked, and it had always worked, and so no one worried about the fact that they didn't understand it anymore. And then it started to fail. Not all at once. Slowly, subtly, FTL routes that had been stable for millennia began to develop faults. Communication relays started producing errors. The deep systems the whole galaxy depended on began, one by one, to unravel as if some fundamental flaw, buried deep in the ancient foundation, had finally begun to spread. And the terrifying thing, the thing that turned worry into panic, was that no one could fix it. The best minds in the galaxy, the Ethereum's finest, the brilliant, fast prodigies, the great institutions, they threw everything they had at the unraveling, and they failed. Completely. Because the ancient system was too complex, too deep, too poorly understood, and their brilliant, fast minds could process it but could not understand it. They could see the symptoms and not the cause. They could describe the failure in exquisite detail and not comprehend why it was happening. The unraveling spread. Root by root, relay by relay, the connective tissue of galactic civilization began to come apart. Worlds started to be cut off. Trade collapsed in the affected regions. And the projections were apocalyptic. If the unraveling couldn't be stopped, the entire galactic civilization would eventually come apart, fragment into isolated worlds, fall into a dark age from which it might never recover. Everything the galaxy had built over tens of thousands of years was going to unravel, and the finest minds in existence could not stop it, because the problem was not a problem of brilliance. It was a problem of understanding. And the galaxy had spent tens of thousands of years cultivating brilliance and mistaking it for understanding. And now, when the difference finally mattered, when everything depended on it, the galaxy discovered it had almost no one who could truly understand anything at all. Almost no one. I was at the Etherium when the desperation reached us. By then I was old, still a junior instructor, still nobody, but I was there in the halls when the greatest institution in the galaxy confronted the fact that it could not solve the problem that was going to end the galaxy. The Etherium threw its full might at the unraveling, every prodigy, every senior mind, every resource, and they failed and failed and failed. I watched the brilliant certainty of the place curdle into something I'd never seen there before: fear. Real fear. The dawning horror of an institution that had always believed it held the finest minds in existence, discovering that its finest minds were not enough, had never been the right kind of mind, that all its beautiful measured brilliance was useless against a problem that required a different thing entirely. And in the middle of that fear, one name started to surface, quietly at first, from the edges, from the frontier where a legend had been growing for 20 years. There's someone, people started to say, out in the dark. They call him the Understander. He solves the unsolvable. He sees to the bottom of things. If anyone can understand the unraveling, it's him. And I remember the day the name reached the Etherium's leadership, because I was in the room, old Orin, the junior instructor, finally in the room where it mattered, and I heard them speak the name of the Understander, and my heart nearly stopped. Because I knew who the Understander was. I'd known him when he was 12. I'd defended him to a review board that expelled him anyway. I'd told him his gift was real when the whole institution told him it wasn't. The Understander was Kai. The boy they'd thrown away. The human child who'd ranked dead last, whom they'd expelled at 12 as a failed experiment, whom the head of the review board had dismissed as charm mistaken for genius, as a slow mind with pleasant eccentricity. That boy had gone out into the dark and become the one mind in the galaxy who might be able to understand the thing that was ending civilization. And now the Etherium, the institution that had cast him out, that had stamped him a failure, that had told a 12-year-old he didn't belong and never had. Now the Etherium was going to have to go and beg him to come back and save them. I asked to be the one to go to him. I insisted on it, actually. Old Orin, who'd never insisted on anything in his life, finally found his voice, because I understood something the Etherium's leadership didn't. I understood that they could not simply summon Kai, could not offer him money or honors or a triumphant return, could not expect him to come running to save the people who'd thrown him away. If anyone was going to reach him, it had to be someone who'd believed in him when no one else had. And there was only one person alive who fit that description. They let me go. They were desperate. They'd have let anyone go who thought they could help. And so I found myself, old and creaking, on a transport out to the frontier, to the edges of the galaxy, to find the boy I'd last seen 20 years before, to ask him to save the civilization that had cast him out. I found him on a small remote world doing exactly what he'd always done, sitting with an impossible problem, some local crisis, wondering his way to the bottom of it. And he was grown now, of course, a man in his 30s, but I knew him the moment I saw him. Same stillness, same total absorption. Same way of looking at everything, like it was endlessly interesting. 20 years hadn't changed the thing that made him Kai. It had only deepened it. He looked up when I came in, and he knew me too. After 20 years he knew me, and a slow smile spread across his face, and he said, "Instructor Orin, you told me my gift was real. You were the only one." He set down his work. "You came a long way to find me, so it must be bad. Tell me what's broken and let's see if we can understand it." He came. Of course he came. That was the first thing that told me the years hadn't hardened him the way they harden most people who have been wronged. I'd braced myself on the long trip out for the possibility that he'd say no, and it would have been fair, more than fair. The galaxy that had thrown him away at 12 now needed him at 32, and he'd have been within every right to look at me and say, "Let them unravel. Let the Etherium and all its brilliant certain minds reap what they sowed. Where were they when I was a frightened child being told I was worthless? Let them save themselves." I half expected him to say it. I'd almost have respected it. He didn't. When I finished explaining the unraveling, the failing systems, the cut-off worlds, the apocalyptic projections, the total failure of the galaxy's finest minds, Kai was quiet for a long while, in that way he had, turning it over. And then he said, "So a lot of people are going to suffer. Ordinary people. On all those worlds that are getting cut off. Not the Etherium. Not the ones who threw me out. Ordinary people who never did anything to me, who are just trying to live the same as anyone." He looked at me. "It was never really about the Etherium, Orin. It was never about proving them wrong or getting them back. The people who will be hurt by this aren't the people who hurt me. And even if they were," he shook his head, "I don't think the point of understanding things is to decide who deserves your help. I think if you can see how to stop suffering, you stop it. That's all, that's the whole of it." He stood up. "Let's go." And that was it. No conditions, no demand for an apology, no relishing the moment. He just packed a small bag and came, to save the civilization that had cast him out, because ordinary people were going to suffer and he could see how to stop it. I have thought many times since that the Etherium, in all its tens of thousands of years of measuring minds, never once thought to measure that, the thing in Kai that mattered most, the thing that made his understanding worth having. They tested for the depth of his mind and found it wanting. They never thought to test the depth of his heart. If they had, they'd have found the deepest one I ever knew. The return to the Etherium was a strange and quiet thing. I'd half imagined a triumphant arrival, the cast-out boy returning in glory. It wasn't like that. Kai didn't want glory. He arrived quietly, unassumingly, the same way he did everything. And if you hadn't known who he was, you'd have taken him for nobody at all. But the Etherium knew who he was. Word had spread. And I watched the greatest institution in the galaxy receive the boy it had expelled, and it was one of the most uncomfortable things I have ever witnessed. Because they needed him, desperately, completely, and they knew what they'd done to him, and they had to stand there in their ancient pride and welcome back the child they'd thrown away, and there was no way to do it that wasn't an admission of the most profound failure in their long history. The head of the review board was still there. Older now, her species lived long, but the same being who dismissed Kai 20 years before as charm mistaken for genius. And she had to greet him. I watched her do it. I watched 3,000 years of certainty stand in front of the living proof of its greatest mistake and try to find something to say. She said stiffly, "We may have underestimated you." And Kai looked at her, and there was no anger in his face. That was the thing that struck me. 20 years and no anger, just a kind of quiet, sad understanding, because of course he understood her, he understood everything, he'd probably understood her better than she understood herself even when he was 12. "You didn't underestimate me," he said gently. "You measured me perfectly by what you could measure. I really was last in the things you tested, that was true." He paused. "Your mistake wasn't the measurement. Your mistake was believing the measurement was the whole of a person. Believing that what you could measure was all there was to measure. That's a very old mistake and a very human one, forgive me, a very universal one, and you're not villains for making it. You just forgot to stay humble about the limits of your own instruments. You got so good at measuring one kind of mind that you stopped believing other kinds existed." He looked around at the great gleaming halls. "There are children out there right now, in this school, being told they're less than they are, because they don't fit the shape you measure for. That's the thing I'd want to change if I changed anything. Not for my sake, for theirs." Then he set down his bag. "But that's for later. Right now you have an unraveling to stop. Show me everything, let's understand it." It took him 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The finest minds in the galaxy had worked on the unraveling for over a year and failed completely. Kai understood it in 6 weeks, and I was there for most of it because I'd appointed myself his assistant, his doorkeeper, his tea bringer, whatever he needed, because I was not going to leave his side for anything. He worked the way he'd always worked, slowly, wondering. He didn't try to out-process the problem the way the brilliant minds had. He sat with it. He asked his strange sideways questions. And where the Ethereum's prodigies had raced to solve the unraveling and failed, Kai did the thing only he could do. He set out simply to understand it, truly, all the way to the bottom. It did not go smoothly at first. I want to be honest about that, because the story is usually told as though he arrived and everyone fell in line, and it wasn't like that. The Ethereum's brilliant minds resented him, deeply. Put yourself in their place. You are the finest intellect your species has ever produced. You have spent your life being told you are among the greatest minds in existence. And now, in the worst crisis in galactic history, the institution has passed you over for a human who ranked dead last, who washed out at 12, who works slowly and asks childish questions. Of course they resented him. Their whole sense of themselves depended on him being wrong. There was one in particular, a senior researcher named Vess, one of the Ethereum's celebrated prodigies, brilliant, fast, the kind of mind that had solved impossible things at an age when most beings were still learning to speak. Vess had led the Ethereum's own effort against the unraveling, had failed along with everyone else, but failed brilliantly, with beautiful, sophisticated work that simply hadn't cracked it. And Vess could not stand Kai, watched him work with open contempt. Because Kai's method looked, to a fast, brilliant mind, like doing nothing. Kai would sit in front of the data for hours and just look at it. Not manipulate it, not run analyses, not generate the dazzling cascades of work the prodigies produced. Just look, wonder, ask a small question and go quiet again. This is what we brought back the failure for, Vess said one day loudly, meaning to be heard, in the great hall where Kai sat with the unraveling data. He stares. That's his method. He stares at the problem we've already analyzed 1,000 ways deeper than he ever could, and he stares. And we're supposed to believe staring will save us when our work couldn't. A bitter sound. The instruments were right about him 20 years ago. We're watching a slow mind pretend that slowness is depth. And I braced for, I don't know what, for Kai to be hurt, for me to have to defend him again, old as I was. But Kai just looked up from the data, without any anger, and he said something to Vess that I've never forgotten, because it was so gentle and so devastating at once. You're right that I'm slow, Kai said. You process this data faster than I ever could. That's true, and it's not false modesty, you genuinely do. He gestured at the great swirling display of the unraveling. But can I ask you something? You've analyzed it 1,000 ways. You've generated more sophisticated work on this than I could produce in a lifetime. So let me ask you the simplest question there is. He paused. Why is it happening? Not how, you know how, in exquisite detail. Why? What is the system actually trying to do? And Vess opened his mouth to answer, and stopped, because he didn't know. In over a year of brilliant work, the Ethereum's finest had described the unraveling in perfect detail, and never once asked what it was for. They'd assumed it was a malfunction, assumed it, without examining the assumption, because a malfunction was the kind of problem their brilliance knew how to attack. They had never asked the slow, wondering question, the childish question, the only question that mattered. Why is it doing this? And in the silence where Vess's answer should have been, I watched the whole gleaming certainty of the Ethereum crack open, just a little, because its most brilliant mind had just discovered there was a question he'd never thought to ask, and that the slow human had asked it in his first hour. Kai wasn't cruel about it. That was the thing, he didn't gloat. He said quietly, I don't know the answer either yet, but I think the answer's in the why, not the how, and I think everyone's been so busy with how that no one sat with why. That's all I'm doing when I stare, Vess. I'm sitting with why. It's slow, but I think why is where it's hiding. And he turned back to the data. And after a long moment I saw this, I'll never forget it. Vess pulled up a chair and sat down next to him and started staring at the data too. The brilliant prodigy, humbled, learning at 30 times his age how to wonder. They worked side by side after that. Vess became one of Kai's fiercest defenders in the end. That's what understanding does when it's real and without malice. It doesn't defeat people, it converts them. And here is what he found. And it's the most beautiful and terrible thing in this whole story, so I want to tell it right. The unraveling was not a malfunction. That was the thing everyone had gotten wrong, the wrong version of the problem they'd all been racing to solve. The ancient system wasn't breaking down. It was doing exactly what it had been designed to do tens of thousands of years ago by its original builders, a safeguard buried so deep in the foundation that everyone had forgotten it existed. The system had been built with a limit, a lifespan. Its original creators, wiser than the civilization that inherited it, had understood that a technology no one understood anymore was a dangerous thing, and they had built in a slow, deliberate unraveling, a failsafe that would begin, after enough millennia, to force the civilization to either truly understand its own foundations again or lose them. It was not a flaw. It was a test. A test left by the ancients for whatever civilization came after, a test that asked one question: do you still understand what holds you up? Or have you forgotten and coasted and let the knowing die? And the galaxy had failed the test. It had forgotten. It had coasted for tens of thousands of years on a foundation it no longer comprehended, cultivating brilliance and mistaking it for understanding. And now the ancient failsafe had come due, and the galaxy could not answer the question, could not prove it still understood. And so the system was doing exactly what it was built to do, unraveling to force the reckoning. The only way to stop it, the only way, was to actually understand the ancient foundation again. To send back the answer the failsafe was waiting for. Not to repair the system, but to comprehend it, truly, all the way down, and by comprehending it, prove to the buried ancient test that the civilization was worthy of keeping what it had. It was a lock that could only be opened by genuine understanding. And genuine understanding was the one thing the galaxy, for all its brilliance, had almost entirely lost. Almost. Except for one cast-out human who had spent 20 years in the dark doing nothing but understanding things all the way to the bottom. Kai understood the ancient foundation. All of it. It took everything he had. 6 weeks of the deepest work I've ever witnessed a mind do, work that left him gaunt and hollow-eyed and further away, some days, than I'd ever seen him. But he did it. He wandered his way down through tens of thousands of years of accumulated complexity to the deep, simple truth the ancients had built, and he understood it truly, the way no one had understood it in ages. And when he understood it, when he could hold the whole vast ancient structure in his mind and see, finally, why it was the way it was, he sent back the answer the failsafe had been waiting for. And the unraveling stopped. All across the galaxy at once the failing system stabilized. The cut-off worlds reconnected. The connective tissue of civilization which had been coming apart root by root, relay by relay, knit itself back together. Because the test had been answered. Because someone finally understood again. The ancient failsafe had asked its question, and after tens of thousands of years the galaxy, through one man who never should have been able to answer, one man they'd thrown away, the galaxy finally answered, yes, we understand. We are worthy of what we were given. It wasn't true, of course. The galaxy as a whole didn't understand. One human did, but that was enough. One mind that truly understood was enough to answer for all of them, to save all of them. And I have thought since that maybe that was part of the ancients' wisdom too, that they knew a whole civilization would never all understand, that understanding is always rare, and that they built their test so that a single deep mind, appearing anywhere in any age, could save the whole. They built a test that could be passed by one, as if they knew that the thing that saves civilizations is never the many, but the rare few who see to the bottom and who choose to help. Every civilization wanted him after that. That's the part of the title that's true, and I've saved it for the end because it's the least important part, though it makes the best story. Once word spread that a single human mind had understood the unraveling and saved galactic civilization, the whole galaxy came for Kai. Every species, every institution, every world. They offered him everything. Wealth beyond counting. Power. The highest honors any civilization could bestow. The Etherium offered him its highest chair, offered to build an entire new school around him, around his kind of mind, to make him the most celebrated intellect in the galaxy. Every civilization that had ignored him, overlooked him, never known he existed, all of them now wanted him, wanted to claim him. Wanted the boy they'd thrown away, now that they knew what he was worth. I watched the delegations come. That's a thing I'll carry to my grave, old Orin, who'd watched them throw this boy away at 12, now watching the great powers of the galaxy line up to beg for him. They came in their finery, in their diplomatic splendor, species that had never in their long histories asked a human for anything, and they stood in line, literally some days. There was a line waiting for an audience with the man they'd overlooked. I recognized some of them. There were representatives there from the very species who, in other rooms on other worlds, had once decided humans were a minor people, unproven, not worth taking seriously. And here they were, hats in hands, as your people say, begging. There was one moment I think about often. A delegation came from a world that had, years before, turned Kai away. He'd offered to help them with some crisis, back when he was still building his quiet reputation. And they dismissed him, this unknown human, this nobody with no credentials, and sent him off. And now that same world sent representatives to plead for his attention, and one of them, an older official, clearly did not remember the earlier dismissal at all. It had meant nothing to them, they'd forgotten it entirely. But Kai remembered. Kai remembered everything. And I watched him receive this official with perfect gentleness, no trace of the old slight, and I understood that he had let it go completely, that he carried none of it, and that this, more than the intelligence, more than saving the galaxy, this was the truly rare thing about him. He'd been thrown away by the whole galaxy, twice over, and he'd kept nothing of the wound. There was no bitterness in him to find. They'd have deserved his contempt, and he simply didn't have any to give them. He'd spent it all long ago, on understanding them instead. And Kai turned all of it down. Every bit of it. The wealth, the power, the honors, the chairs. He didn't want any of it, and he'd never wanted any of it, and success hadn't changed him any more than exile had. When they pressed him, when they could not understand how anyone could refuse what they were offering, he explained it gently, the way he explained everything. I spent 20 years going to the places that were stuck, he said. The desperate places, the ones everyone gave up on, the ones no one important was watching, and I found something out there. I found that those places, the overlooked ones, the written-off ones, that's where the real work is. That's where a person can actually help. Not up here in the gleaming halls with the honors and the chairs. Out there, where they need you. He looked around at all the desperate offers, all the civilizations wanting him. You want me now because I saved you, because I'm valuable, because I proved I was worth something by your measures. But that's exactly the mistake that started all of this. You still think worth is a thing you can measure and claim. It isn't. Worth is what you do when no one's watching, in the places no one values, for the people no one else will help. He shook his head. I'm not going to be your celebrated genius. I'm going back to the dark. There are still stuck places out there. There are still people no one's coming to save. That's where I belong. That's where I always belonged. You had it right the first time. In a way, I never did belong here. I just belonged somewhere better. And he left. Went back out to the frontier, to the overlooked places, to keep doing the quiet, deep work he'd always done. The most wanted mind in the galaxy, walking away from all of it, back into the dark, because the dark was where the work was. But he did one thing before he went. One thing that mattered more than saving the galaxy, I think, in the long run. He made them change the tests. It was the one condition he set, the only thing he asked for in exchange for saving them. He told the Ethereum, "You will change how you measure minds. You will stop believing your instruments see everything. You will make room for the slow ones, the deep ones, the wondering ones, the children who don't fit the shape you measure for. You will never again throw away a 12-year-old because your tests can't see what they are. That's my price. That's the only thing I want. Not for me. For all the ones who come after me, who'd be thrown away the same way if you don't change." And they changed. Of course they changed. They'd have agreed to anything in their desperation, and this cost them nothing but their pride. The Ethereum reformed its tests, its rankings, its whole ancient certainty about what genius was. It began, for the first time in tens of thousands of years, to look for the kinds of minds it had always thrown away. And over the years that followed, it found them, the slow, deep, wondering ones, and it kept them and taught them, and some of them became extraordinary, minds the old Ethereum would have expelled at 12. I stayed to see it. I was very old by then, but I stayed, because I'd spent my whole career at that institution watching it throw away the wrong children, and I wanted to see it learn to keep them. And it did. Slowly, imperfectly, but it did. Kai's real legacy wasn't saving the galaxy. It was every overlooked child the Ethereum didn't throw away in all the years after, because one thrown-away child came back and made them see. I saw him one last time years later. He came through quietly on his way to some stuck place on the far frontier, and he found me, old Orin, ancient now, near the end. And we sat together, the instructor and the student, the way we had when he was 12, and we talked. I asked him if he ever regretted it, turning down everything they offered. All that wealth, all that glory, the highest honors in the galaxy, choosing the dark instead. And he smiled that same slow smile, and he said, "Orin, they threw me out at 12 for being the wrong kind of mind, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it sent me out into the dark where I found the work that was actually mine, and became the person I was actually meant to be. If they'd kept me, if I'd fit their shape, ranked high, become one of their celebrated brilliant minds, I'd have spent my life up here in the gleaming halls, solving elegant problems for people who didn't need the help. I'd never have gone to the stuck places. I'd never have learned to understand things all the way to the bottom. I'd never have been able to save anyone." He looked at me. "They meant it as a punishment. It was a gift. The worst thing they ever did to me made me into the only person who could do the thing that mattered most. I can't regret that. I can only be grateful for it, and try to make sure the next thrown-away kid gets the same chance to find out what they really are." He left the next day. Back to the dark. I never saw him again. I died not long after, old and content, having seen the thing I most wanted to see, which was the thrown-away boy become everything I'd known he could be. But I made sure the story got told. This story. Because there's a lesson in it that the galaxy keeps needing to relearn over and over in every age. They cast out the Wonder Kid at 12 because their instruments couldn't see what he was. And 20 years later, every civilization in the galaxy wanted him back, not because he'd changed, but because they'd finally hit a problem their instruments couldn't solve, and discovered too late that the thing they'd thrown away was the only thing that could save them. The mind that saves you is almost never the one your tests were built to find. The person who matters most is almost always the one everyone overlooked. And the child you throw away for not fitting the shape you measure for, that child might just be the one who understands, all the way to the bottom, the thing that will someday matter more than anything you ever measured. They had the eyes to measure him. They never had the eyes to see him. He went and found the ones who did. And in the end, so did the whole galaxy, but only after the dark had made him into exactly what they'd thrown away, and exactly what they needed, and exactly what they'd never known how to keep.